Great. Now, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to come present to you all. I've really enjoyed your reflections throughout, the comments, the questions you've made. And I guess I'll just ask that even though this is the last session, okay, of the day, please keep those comments, please keep those questions coming. Okay, I look forward to speaking to you more about this tomorrow as well. Okay, but let's. I know it's the last session, but let's get through it. And I promise you that as long as people participate, we will finish on time. But if people don't participate, then I could just start talking and talking and talking, and we could all go to sleep here. So let's participate, okay, and keep this exciting all the way to the end. Great. So look, the mandate for I guess the today's talk, right, is actually threefold, and it's I'm going to try to do three different things. The first one is to give you a little bit of an overview of the World Bank Tax Data Lab, so DATAX, right, which Panos has already briefly referred to, right? The second one is to do a deep dive on thinking about simplified tax regimes as a way to tackle informality and what are some of the trade offs, right, that you face as policymakers. And the third one is I just want to give a quick taste or sort of a quick mention to some of the studies which we're doing about informality in the region. Okay, and I hope what you will walk away with today is a sense of the need to analyze the micro data, right? And the lessons that you can learn if you do that, right? So that's hopefully what you'll walk away with, okay? And I think some of the challenges have already been discussed, but they're not insurmountable, right? That these challenges are worth fighting to get access to the data so then you can learn what's actually going on and make very good decisions around tax policy and tax administration. So let me jump in quickly. I'll try to knock it over in 5 minutes or so. What is DATAX, right? The World Bank Tax Data Lab. And you wouldn't be here if you didn't, weren't interested or weren't concerned about revenue, right? I think the challenges that governments face in this space are very clear, right? You want to raise revenue in a way that's efficient, a way that's environmentally friendly, a way that's equitable. I think the challenge is well known. But what's new, right? What's new to right? What's the opportunity that DATAX is trying to bring to the table? And I guess it's helpful to think about this. I try to spell it out to people like this, which is that uh, look, there exists data that covers the entire formal economy, right? In your countries, in other countries, the entire formal economy that is collected in high frequency, right? In a panel structure. So you can track the same individual or same firm over time. It's free, right? Like you don't have to pay more money to collect that. But in most countries, in most cases, hardly anyone's looking at this data, right? So you have data covering the entire economy, micro data on the entire economy that's frequently collected, that's in a panel structure, that's free, that hardly anyone's looking at, right? And that's where DATAX tries to come in to solve this and utilize really this. This is like a treasure chest of data that governments have access to that aren't being fully utilized. And then with that, what does the DATAX team do? Well, it works very closely with you, with counterparts, right? In ministries of finance, in revenue authorities, right? To tackle key questions, to generate knowledge that's useful for other teams, to have capacity building training sessions, a lot of work, and I'm going to walk through this in the case of what we did in Kenya, as well as sort of dissemination and knowledge sharing activities. And so how do we go, like, what are the sort of questions? Well, I mean, you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in these questions, right? These are the sorts of questions we're interested in. We're interested in around tax compliance. We're interested in how you can use this micro data, not just to learn about tax compliance, but also to learn about growth, right? To learn about what's going on in your economies, right? How what can how can you utilize administrative data to learn about equity, right, and promote equity? And how can you learn more broadly about firms, jobs, trade? You know, these are sort of big questions that you can answer with by analyzing microdata, and that's what the team at the World Bank Tax Data Lab's doing by partnering with you, right, with client countries around the world. How do we go about it? Well, you know, these questions aren't come up with like in DC somewhere. Do you know what I mean? These questions come about through actually discussions with policymakers like yourselves. What are the challenges that you're facing, right? Uh, now we're sending you to sleep with that music. So yeah, I'll try and get you excited about this, right? Okay. Um, a lot of capacity building, right, and training. And also, we take data protection very seriously, right? So, if you're interested in this, and we can explain how we kind of go about doing this to ensure that you can comply with your tax data laws and confidentiality in your country, but also to utilize the data you have. And there's so many models that we've applied uh, with doing this. So that gives you a little. I feel like that gave you a crash course, a bit of a flavor in terms of what we're doing. I see any questions or no, you're just stretching? Yep. Yeah, okay, cool. Well, feel free to stretch, but if you have questions, feel free to ask any questions because I'm about to change gears entirely and talk about an example of how we went about, how the day tax team went about engaging with a sort of client, with a partner, in the case of Kenya, to understand about simplified tax regimes. Okay, no questions. So it's either super clear or super confusing. So no one wants to ask any questions. So that's good to know. So look, I'm going to sort of mainly talk to you today about simplified tax regimes and how they're used in tackling informality. Now, many countries refer to informality, but actually what they more mean is the taxation of small businesses, right? And it's worth kind of just sort of thinking about in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, which is what I'm largely going to focus on, right? But a lot of these lessons are very relevant in the East Asian context as well, right? Particularly, I guess, in some of the lower income settings, right? Small businesses are the main way how households in sub-Saharan Africa bring in cash income, right? So this is the main way how households are bringing in income, but they contribute hardly anything to revenue. And I'm sure if you look at the case in your own countries, you'll see that small businesses, while they are a large employer, right, they actually don't bring in very much revenue at all. So there is this belief by a lot of governments that, oh, there's this gold mine out there. There's all these small businesses that if only we could tax, right, would bring in so much revenue, right? And so, how do they go about approaching this? So, registering informal businesses is a key focus. But then, when businesses are brought into the tax net, so when they are formalized, they don't go straight to like a corporate income tax regime, which is, or a personal income tax regime, which is more complicated to comply with. There's this idea of a simplified tax regime. So in your country, you may call it like a presumptive tax regime or a turnover tax regime. And I just want a quick show of hands to make sure that you're still awake, right? A quick show of hands. Do you have a simplified tax regime in your country? So can you please raise your hand if you have some form of simplified tax regime? So yes in Korea, yes in Cambodia, yes in Mongolia, Philippines, Brunei. Do, is there one in Thailand? Used to. Okay. Yep. So you have a complicated tax regime. Yep. For small businesses. Okay. Cool. And then what about Lao?
The new law is already indicated that um, for the enforcement, will be like have for the we call micro enterprise that need to comply with the full implementation. So
Yep.
that's on the process. I Yeah, but before that, yeah, we have the simplify for the micro one. Yeah.
Great. And then in Malaysia, no. No. Okay, great. But I think some of these lessons you can think in terms of uh, how to tax small businesses are going to be relevant whether you have a simplified tax regime or not. Okay, but when policymakers right have designed simplified tax regimes, right, and I'm going to keep calling them simplified tax regimes, but in your mind it may be presumptive tax, it may be turnover tax, whatever you call it, right? So when they design this, okay, they want to do it in a way that's easier and fairer than corporate income tax. But we actually know very little about how well simplified tax regimes achieve these objectives of bringing in revenue, right, maintaining equity or promoting equity, right, and then also keeping things simple. Right? So that's the sort of logic, that's the sort of framing for the study that we go to do here. So when it comes to a simplified tax regime, it's simple, right? There's only three main questions you need to ask. You need to ask, right? Who are you going to tax? How are you going to tax them? And how much are you going to tax them? Right? So this is quite straightforward, right? So uh, when we think about who, the question is, do you have like a threshold, like a minimum threshold? Sort of where is the maximum threshold? Right? When we think about how, do you make people pay a percentage of their turnover? Do you make them pay a set fee? Right? These are sort of the two main options, right? You're not doing a more complicated sort of profit regime, it's not like corporate income tax. Really, it's just about, is it a set fee or is it a percentage of turnover? And then in terms of how much, it's like, what's the effective tax rate? So how much are you trying to get firms to pay? So looks straightforward, doesn't it? But from this point, I want to be able to, I'm going to illustrate to you that there's really clear trade offs, right? And these trade offs are in the dimension in terms of revenue, equity, and simplicity. So let me walk this through with you, right? So let's think about the most easiest example. Imagine you made all small businesses pay a set fee. Okay, that's going to bring in revenue. That's really simple, right? To implement, right? It's like, hey, you're a small business, pay me X amount of money, right? But that's highly unequal, right? Because the smallest businesses are having to pay a much higher effective tax rate, right? Relative to the larger small businesses, right? So that's why a lot of countries say we can't have a set fee. We're going to make people pay a percentage of their turnover. So that way you bring in revenue, right? Because it's equitable, because then it's proportional, right? So everyone pays a certain percentage of whatever their turnover is. But that's not simple to comply with, because these small businesses have to then track exactly what their turnover is, right? So it's like you can't win, right? There's no easy way to do this. Now, another way of potentially approaching this would be to have a very high threshold, right? So potentially even have the threshold so high that your threshold it aligns with the VAT threshold, right? And now that's pretty simple because you're actually making that if the firm has to comply with VAT, they already have to have some basic accounting, right? It's quite equitable because you're excluding smaller businesses, but it's not going to bring in any revenue, and that's not what governments want to do, right? So the point is that you kind of, no matter how you go about designing a simplified tax regime, you're always going to forego one of these key dimensions, right, of your objectives. And in the case of sub Saharan Africa, we did a review to see what countries are doing. And we found around half the countries, right, have a minimum threshold. It's around 40% of countries have a minimum threshold. So that means that there is some effort to exempt the smallest taxpayers, right? But okay, so that in the other half of the countries, or in the other 60% of the countries, right, that don't have a minimum threshold, that means even if you're a very small street vendor who's trying to sell maybe pineapples or something like this, the moment you make a single dollar, right, you're meant to pay tax on that. So this decision in terms of whether to have a minimum threshold or not, and the fact that half of countries don't have a minimum threshold is quite striking, right? That you're taxing such small businesses. We also found that around 60% of countries are relying on a percentage of turnover, right? So that's more equitable. It's going to bring in revenue, but the issue is that's not very simple to comply with, right? Because these firms need to know exactly what their turnover is. And then we looked at how the effective tax rate. So I can't help myself. So Penos wanted to know about the effective tax rates on firms. So we looked at this in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, right? And what we did was we compared the effective tax rate for a firm that was in the simplified tax regime relative to if they were paying CIT. And we found that across the whole continent, in some countries, if you made a profit of 2%, you'd be better off being in the simplified tax regime. But in other countries, you'd have to make a profit of 18% before you'd be better off being in the simplified tax regime. So, in other words, there's huge variation in terms of the actual how much governments are trying to sort of tax small businesses. So, at this point, I hope what you've kind of walked away with is realize that this is a major tax policy, tax administration sort of challenge for governments to work through. And this is what the Kenyan government came to the World Bank with, right? And that's where I'm about to go now and explain to you the journey we went on with the Kenyan government as to think about how they should design their simplified tax regime. Cool. Great. So, um, and this is a bit of a I is intentionally goes into a little bit of detail, the journey, but I think it shows you the value of collaborating with the World Bank or with an external sort of partner. Doesn't need to necessarily be the World Bank, uh, but it shows you the journey we all went on together, right? So the Kenyan Revenue Authority approached us and said, how do we go about taxing small businesses? How do we design our simplified tax regime? And the first thing we did was a lot of training. So we trained a lot of the staff, so in total over 250 staff in the KRA about different sort of tax analysis techniques, impact evaluation, data analytics, behavioral science, right? Uh, we kind of, once we gave them sort of basic grounding in the sort of techniques and skills, we did a series of focus groups to then design a survey of small businesses. And then once we'd done this sort of first diagnostics work, the KRA felt comfortable to then share with us their entire sort of over a decade's worth of administrative data, right? So they shared with us all the data that they had on the simplified tax regime in Kenya. So we could then analyze that data, and I'm going to show you some of the insights from that data, right? To learn about the simplified tax regime, to learn about sort of how it was functioning well, how it wasn't functioning so well. And then we could work with them to design randomized control trials to be able to test different interventions. Because while we might look at the data, we might do surveys, we might do focus groups, and we might see, oh, maybe there's ways to improve the regime in one way or another. As Penos was saying, right, you need to be conservative. You need to trial and test what you do. You don't just come up with an idea and then just do it, right? So we identified a series of potential improvements, and then we did a number of randomized controlled trials, and we did follow-up surveys with taxpayers so that we could better understand some of their responses, right? So hopefully this gives you a bit of a flavor of how like a close collaboration, right, where you dig deep into the data, you can actually learn so much about a key sort of tax policy, tax administration challenge. And it's worth just highlighting that, this didn't happen overnight, right? This was a few years of collaborating. We did a lot of trainings, but also uh, some of the officials from the Kenyan Revenue Authority, so the KRA, they actually journeyed with us to other countries and shared their experience, right? What it was like to go on this big long journey that I just explained there. Okay, and we were able to build those relationships, and I think we all, I guess, valued the benefit of collaborating a lot. So hopefully you can get a sense here of like that collaborating can actually lead to great insights and great developments on both sides, right, in terms of what you learn. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I know some people are talking a bit, but I mean, if you have any questions or comments at any time, please feel free to just jump in and ask a question. Yep, cool. So, actually, any questions or comments at this before I get into some of the results? Now, everyone's keen to see what did once we got access to the data, what did we see? Is that what you want to know? Yeah. So a great question here, which was this journey that I'm going to show you. Like, what was the time period, right? So about 3 years, right? Um, so this wasn't a sort of 5 minute exchange. Some of the things that we did here, but I think you could do in a shorter time period if you wanted to. Like analyzing the tax data doesn't take 3 years. It's more just the development, right, of the relationships and collaborating, right, that did that. But I think one thing that's useful to highlight is that uh, the revenue uh, sort of community here, you're just launching. You're going to be around for many years to come. The World Bank's in the region. Other partners are in the region for many years to come. Like approaching this with a medium term mindset makes a lot of sense. But yep.
So my first part of my question is what initiated the engagement there, and the second part of my question is maybe relevant for some others. What kind of political support would the revenue authority in Kenya would have to obtain to make this possible? Maybe you can share a little bit about how the project came about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so. uh, One of the things that's really nice about this sort of work, because it's not just in Kenya that we've done this work, right? It's in many countries. So the DayTax, so the World Bank Tax Data Lab, has worked with over 25 countries, right, around the world, right? Uh, it tends to be more at the working level, right? So actually, probably all of you who are in the room, right? If you were interested and you felt like there was potential to get some openness from your managers to at least have conversations, right, with other people, to have capacity building, have those sorts of things occur, which I'm sure is the case probably in many of your countries, right? That's how this sort of work comes about. Initially, it was they approached the World Bank, so the Kenyan Revenue Authority approached the World Bank at the very much at the working level, right? So the manager of research and the chief manager of research, so innovation and data, right? They approached the World Bank and said, we need to understand how to design a simplified tax regime. Um, and they had permission to speak to people. And if you're here in person or if you're joining online, I'm sure you have permission to speak. So I think it's not necessary for there to be like a presidential mandate or something like this, to have a conversation. Like, I think it's like, if you're here already, that's already, I think, enough scope to collaborate. Yeah.
I have a question as well on the analysis and sharing of admin data. So we have a number of countries in the region that have strict privacy laws, or not necessarily strict, but maybe ambiguous. So the people interpret them as strict. So different countries, different examples. But so just I guess one, whether there's an element of that you come across in Kenya, and two, even if you have not, I know that there are ways to go around this. So maybe you can speak to those. Some of those are anonymization techniques, but also working directly at the offices of the minister, sort of ministry, and working on their computers and whatnot, right? Just I don't know if you sort of share examples or reflections on sort of that element.
Yeah, no, great question. And I'm very happy to answer those questions like before I get into sort of like some of the results of looking at the admin data. So it's like, what's the sort of process? So how does like the DATAX, like the World Bank Tax Data Lab, sort of establish that data sharing, right? Type of arrangement. Now, I think there's a real continuum that countries are on. The most strictest version, right, is one in which um, no one from outside ever analyzes any data at all, right? So what happens is you generate fake data, then say you will share the fake data with, say, the World Bank or with an external researcher. They will run, like, say, on Stata or on R, they'll do like a script, right? So coding up based on the fake data. They'll then send that sort of do file in the case of Stata, right? They'll send that code to you, and then you will run it with the data yourself, and then there will be like a table, right, or a graph or something or another like this, and this will be a very iterative process, right? So that's one way. Another way is that actually there will be external parties, right, go to your offices and sit there with you, right, and work with you to look at the actual data, sorry, de-identified data, no one's names, no one addresses, no one's phone numbers, right? But actually the data then never leaves the building, right? It all occurs in the building. In the case of Kenya, what would happen would be that the revenue authority would actually de-identify all the data. So it was like there was no information about any firm, any individual, no phone numbers, no address, nothing like that, right? And then they would share the data with us via like a sort of I guess a confidential like OneDrive link, right? So they would share that data to us, and then we could download that data, and we had to sign like a non sort of confidentiality agreements, right? So non-disclosure agreements, right? So that was the way how it's done. Then what some countries do, and this is the example that Penos was sharing before in terms of the tax data lab, right? They will actually make available online. You have to fill in a form, right, to say, I'm a researcher, or I'm in the Ministry of Finance in this country. I would like to have access to that data, and they will provide you with that data online. So it's all de-identified, right? So hopefully this gives you a flavor of like maybe your country's not ready to sort of put data up online, do you know what I mean? But surely you can think of a situation whereby maybe if the data never left the building, then external researchers and external collaborators could come in and work with you on that data. Or if fake data was provided and a script was run, some code was run, then that could be another way of approaching this. So cool. Great. Let's get into some of the results, right? Because I think like you're sitting there, we've been talking a lot about data, but it's like, what can you learn if you actually look at the data? Well, this is what we learned in the case of Kenya, right? So some of the diagnostic activities, right, we did was we found that there's a minimum threshold in place, but the vast majority of businesses that pay tax in the simplified tax regime are below the minimum threshold. So I'll explain more shortly on that, right? We found that the simplified tax regime, the upper threshold was really, really high, right? But once a business reaches the VAT threshold, they almost always, almost certainly are going to go under the corporate income tax regime. So having a simplified tax regime that overlaps, there's a upper threshold above the VAT sort of threshold makes no sense at all. Like, at least in the case of Kenya, there was effectively no businesses there, right? We found that when businesses were asked to calculate a percentage of their turnover, many businesses struggled to do this. And I think the classic way that we illustrate this is around of 1/3 of all tax declarations are identical. So every month, everyone is just saying the same amount, right? So like there's no relationship between what your turnover was, right, and how much tax you're paying, right? So, and then we do some survey work to show this issue as well. Uh, but what we do find is that businesses are very responsive to changes in tax rates. So even if they have no idea what it is, what they should be paying, if you try to tax them more, they're going to lower the declared turnover to offset, right, some of that. Okay, so these are sort of some major challenges that we learnt from looking at the data. But still, despite these major challenges, we would have senior people in the KRA, senior people in the World Bank say to us, but there's still a lot of value in having the simplified tax regime the way it is. And would say, but why? Why? And they say to us for two reasons. One is because a simplified tax regime is an on ramp. It's a way that you bring in firms that are in the informal sector, bring them into the formal sector, and then they graduate and start paying CIT in the future, right? So this is a way to bring firms in, and then as they grow, they're going to bring in so much revenue. They said the other reason is because all this data is providing so much information about the Kenyan economy, and the government's learning so much from analyzing this data. So we push back on both of those reasons. We went and matched all the CIT data with all the simplified tax regime data for over a decade, and we found that out of over 50,000 firms in the simplified tax regime, actually, let's to try and wake you guys up a little bit. Does anyone want to guess, out of the 50,000 firms in the simplified tax regime, how many graduated to pay corporate income tax? So how many graduated out of the simplified tax regime and started paying corporate income tax? So over the last decade, over 50,000 firms were in the simplified tax regime in Kenya. How many graduated and went into the simplified tax, went out of the simplified tax regime into the corporate income tax regime? Any guesses? Any guesses? I'm taking 1%. Okay, we got 1% here, so that's 500. Any other guesses? Any other guesses out of 50,000? 7. Okay, so we have 7. We have 500. Any other? Any others? Any other guesses? Any other guesses? So out of 50,000 firms, so 50,000 firms were in the simplified tax regime, how many graduated and went to the corporate income tax regime? 4 or 5,000? Yeah, 10%? Okay, so maybe 5,000? Okay. 52. 52 out of over 50,000 went out of the simplified tax regime into the corporate income tax regime. So we can say, at least in the case of Kenya, if you're justifying having a simplified tax regime on the basis of, even if it's not working well, it's an on ramp for firms then to start paying corporate income tax, we can say, well, that's not what's happening, right? Firms aren't transitioning out of the simplified tax regime and starting to pay corporate income tax. So then what about this other idea, which is maybe all this data is being analyzed and everything? After spending many weeks in the Kenyan Revenue Authority sitting there with the big, they have like the supercomputer with all the data that they have there, and that when we have sat there and spent many days trying to access the data and getting access to the data, I can reassure you that no one ever looked at that data ever until we did, right? So this data is not being used. So I guess the part of what I'm trying to illustrate to you here is that by looking at the data, we not only learnt problems with the existing system, right? We were also able to interrogate, I guess, some of the interrogate is maybe too strong a word. We were able to explore some of the comments that were made to us, right, by both senior people in the KRA, but also very senior people at the World Bank, right, who were telling us, no, no, there's still good reasons to do this, right? So that's part of, I guess, hopefully what you can walk away with, which is when you look at the data, you can learn so much about what's actually going on. Any comments or questions on this before I sort of maybe move on? Okay. Cool. Okay. So I'm conscious of the time, but I just want to show you some graphs to because I think it's helpful. I've told you in bullet points, but let's have a look at some of these things in terms of a graph. I might just jump through and only show you a couple. But what this shows you is that over the last decade, right, the share of all firms that were below the minimum tax threshold and how much revenue they paid, right, as a share of the revenue. So what you can see here, if you look at it, is like over the last decade in Kenya, right, around 2/3 of all businesses in the simplified tax regime were below the minimum threshold, and around 1/3 of all the tax they collected, so we're talking about millions and millions and millions of US dollars, were collected from very small businesses that never should have been paying tax in the first place. So, how does this happen? That's probably what you're thinking to yourself. But I kind of want to highlight to you this is potentially happening in your countries as well, potentially. So, it's worth thinking about how binding these minimum thresholds are in practice. So, what happens is the minimum threshold is set annually. So, it's an annual minimum threshold. The logic being that there's some seasonality, right, in when you earn income. So, we need to have the annual threshold, right? We can't have a monthly threshold. But then firms are required to pay each month because of a liquidity concern. Because it's like you can't say once a year firms have to pay a huge amount of money, just every month they pay a small amount of money. But what that means that in any given month, the KRA doesn't actually know how much that firm's going to earn across the year as a whole. So they take whatever money they're paid. And then it was quite funny because I said to, when I was presenting this to senior management in the KRA, I said, like, but there would be a really easy way to fix this. Provide refunds to these firms, at which point everyone in the room burst out laughing because there's no way they're going to provide refunds to small firms. That would be way more effort than what it was worth, right? So you're in this situation whereby this situation of a minimum threshold kind of not being binding is potentially an issue that could exist in some of your countries. I know that after doing this work and producing it, right, we actually learnt that many, many other countries went, reviewed their data, and then saw that they were doing something similar as well, right? So maybe it's worth checking this. Cool. Let me, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump through this. Maybe it's just worth highlighting this. I kind of highlighted how 1/3 of all tax declarations were identical. Part of doing the surveys as well as looking the administrative data was it gave us a chance to be able to learn sort of from the taxpayers themselves about their ability, their perspectives, right? What's going on. And we found that many, many taxpayers, a very large share of taxpayers, couldn't calculate a basic percentage, right, of their turnover and then didn't have written records. So if you don't have written records, you definitely can't know what your turnover was in a given month. But even if you did have written records, right, a lot of taxpayers struggled to calculate basic percentages. So even if they knew what the right amount was, they still maybe couldn't do that calculation accurately, right? I mentioned how taxpayers respond to a tax rate increase in this way. So, uh, look, there's a lot of issues we've highlighted with the existing regime. So that led us to work with the KRA to say, look, is there a better way? Is there a better way to tax small businesses? Okay. And we did our randomized control trial where we provided taxpayers with a set fee to pay instead of a percentage. But if we provided them with just like every small business in the country a set fee, that's not going to be very equitable, right? So what we did instead was we customized the set fee. We already know some characteristics about the firms, right? We know what their location is, we know what industry they're in, right? We know some other characteristics about them, such as how long they've actually been a taxpayer for. We don't have a huge amount of information, but by looking at the data, we could still begin to sort of narrow down on different aspects of taxpayers and then determine approximately what do most taxpayers like them pay, right? And then provide taxpayers with a suggestion, right, for what that would mean in terms of how much tax they should pay if they paid similar to taxpayers like them. So this is an interesting example of we looked at the admin data, we did surveys, right, but now we want to try something new, right? We want to see what if we customized a set fee to taxpayers. And the appropriate way to test this properly, right, is to not just roll it out tomorrow, right? It's to trial it. And so we did a randomized control trial with 10,000 of these taxpayers, and people were allocated to either a sort of a business as usual group, a group that received just a reminder, right? So a basic correspondence, right, about what the tax regime was, and then a group that received some information that was customized just to them. And let me show you what the messages were, right? So if you were in the reminder, right, you just received some summary in terms of what you were expected to do under the simplified tax regime. But then if you were in what we're calling here the anchor group, the group that received like the customized information, the only difference was they had one sentence here saying on average businesses similar to you pay this much per month, right? So we provided these messages. Does anyone want to have a guess what the effect was? Does anyone want to have a guess what the effect was of, uh, you know, do you think this message providing this information, do you think it increased the amount of tax that was collected? Do you think it had no effect? Does anyone want to have a guess? We're going to finish in 15 minutes, I promise, but it's going to be easier if instead of me asking you the same question 3 times, someone provides an answer. Increase? Yep, the one on the right one increases. So that this, sorry? Okay, yeah. Well, correct. There was an increase. In the interest of time, I'm not going to explain all the differences of this chart, but effectively the message that provided customized information did actually increase, right? But does anyone want to have a guess? I mean, you've got the slides in front of you if you've looked at it. So does anyone want to have a guess which taxpayers responded the most to this? Do you think it was the smallest taxpayers? Do you think it was the largest taxpayers? The small ones. I appreciate the participation the Thailand delegation has shown. So, uh, what OT? Yep. So that's the treatment on treated effects. I'll explain to you later in terms of this, but just think about this in terms of we roughly saw that there was around a sort of 20% increase in the amount of tax paid, right, in the group that received the customized information, right? So around 20% increase, right? And it was entirely driven by smaller taxpayers, those taxpayers that were below the median. So, good job, the Thai delegation. They top marks for participation and giving the right answers, right? So, remember how I started off saying how you can't design a simplified tax regime in a way that brings in more revenue, that's simpler, and does it more equitably? That's exactly what we're seeing right here, right? So, what we've done is we made it simpler, but we reduced the equity. in the system here. Look, I'm conscious of the time. We have an ongoing trial now um, where the preliminary results are really showing a very similar story, right? Whereby we try to simplify things, we make the minimum threshold salient, right? So that people stop paying who are below the minimum threshold. And what we find is that the smallest taxpayers respond to that by actually paying more than the minimum threshold. So as a result, we made it simpler, but then we made it less equitable again, right? So this seems to be a pattern, right, which is hard to avoid. Um, and look, there's some important implications that I wanted to get to, which is given governments can't raise revenue equitably in a simple way, right? So you can't achieve those objectives. There's a real question, I think, in terms for governments to sort of think through, does it make sense to allocate a lot of resources to focus on small businesses? This is something that, at least in sub Saharan Africa, is a preoccupation with policymakers. They're seen as this huge amount of money that small businesses can bring in. Because remember how at the start I told you that this is actually the main way how households bring in money? So that as a result, policymakers are like, we need to go after them and bring in, and that's going to help us bring in more revenue. We need to have these simple tax regimes, and we're going to be able to do it in a way that's kind of fair or equitable. But that just doesn't seem to be possible, right? And this example, I think, really should be like a warning, I think, to governments everywhere about the challenges of trying to tax small businesses in a way that fully meets your objectives. Hopefully, it also gets you excited about what you can learn by looking at the data, right? From in terms of the KRA, they were very excited, right? They made some major changes to the way that they go about taxing small businesses, and we're still on that journey together, right? I mentioned we have an ongoing trial, but I just want to share one small thing that came out of this collaboration, which I'm sure you could potentially consider is very applicable in your countries as well, is we found that the subnational governments, so the local governments, they had far more information about businesses than what the national government had, the KRA, right? So what we could actually do was we worked with the KRA to link what the subnational governments had with what the KRA had, and we found that in Nairobi alone, there were more than 200,000 small businesses that were active, registered with the local government, should have been paying tax, right? But weren't. And now we had their phone numbers, emails, and addresses, right? So we could dramatically improve the enforcement, right, by just simply mapping, linking data, right, across different government data sets, right? So that was something that I'm very excited about. So, yeah, I'm running out of time, and I guess I kind of want to make sure that you walk away from here being excited, but also that we walk away from here early. So I guess I kind of just want to flag these two studies because I think they show you other elements to this question of simplifying of taxing small businesses, so beyond simplified tax regimes. And I think it also will hopefully give you a sense of like, this isn't something foreign. This isn't something that's just happening like in sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America. Like these studies, this work is happening here in the region. And so I'm going to point to the example of in the case of Indonesia, we have an ongoing study where what we're interested in looking at is how small businesses, particularly those in the simplified tax regime, how their behavior impacts the behavior of larger businesses, right? And then also informal businesses, right? Because we have a previous study that we've done which showed that larger businesses were more likely to evade tax if there were more informal businesses, right, in their area. And this variation was quite high, right? So we saw like a 50% higher rate of tax evasion. And I'm not going to go into all the details. I can send you the link if you're interested in the study. But I guess the thing is that we can see there's like these spillover effects. So maybe the governments should register sort of these informal businesses, even if they're not going to get very much revenue out of them, but because that then affects the way how larger firms behave. Right, so this is part of the sort of what we're exploring in the case of Indonesia, and we're just trying to understand what leads firms to make that decision to move from informal to formal. Right, another whole dimension to this is some work that we're doing in Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea, if you ask people in Papua New Guinea, they'll tell you it's in East Asia. I don't know, maybe you guys don't think that it's in East Asia, but anyway, it's close enough. It shares a border with sort of, West Papua. So let's just call it in East Asia for this purpose, right? In Papua New Guinea, we're looking at the fact that registered businesses collect VAT, right, on the products they sell on behalf of the government, right? And they transmit that money to the government. So maybe it's the case that governments might want to register informal businesses, right? Even if you're not going to get much revenue out of those informal businesses in terms of those businesses' own income, but you're interested in the informal businesses becoming formal businesses, so then they will be a way of collecting VAT right from consumers. So this is another element to think about in terms of this broader discussion. But in the case of both the work in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, this isn't happening like in abstract. This is happening in close collaboration with the revenue authorities in those countries and sharing of administrative data, right? So, and that's such a crucial part of this. In the case of Papua New Guinea, we have administrative data like from multiple government agencies. We have phone surveys, we're scraping websites, right, as well as primary data collection as well. So where does this all leave us? I feel like I've gone through a lot, right, in the last, and you bared with me, and I appreciate it a lot. But I think like if you're interested in these questions, which no doubt you are if you're part of this community of practice, right, around boosting tax compliance, boosting revenue, but as well as the role of administrative data and how you can use that, right, to learn about the economy as a whole, about how that relates to equity, around how that relates to firms, jobs, and trade. I think it's worth thinking about and reaching out to DayTax and are having serious discussions about the potential to collaborate further in this space. So I guess I'll draw it to a close there in terms of happy to take some Q&A, but I'm also keen to make sure I finish on time, but happy to continue speaking with each of you afterwards and then also tomorrow morning as well.